My stepmother wanted to take away my house, so I deprived her of everything. My stepmother Marla stood in the middle of the living room, arms crossed, staring at me as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience. "The house isn't big enough for all of us, and you're grown now, Thane," she said, her voice firm but devoid of emotion. "You'll have to find somewhere else to live." I was 18 years old and had just been kicked out of my own home. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that my father, Bernard, stood beside her, silent and unwilling to defend me, or the fact that I had nowhere to go. At least, that's what they thought. But they had forgotten something. The house they had just thrown me out of. It legally belonged to me. I suppose I should start from the beginning, before my father married Marla, before I even understood that my family was different from others. My parents, Francine and Bernard, had wanted a child for years. After multiple failed attempts, when my mother finally became pregnant with me, they considered it a miracle. My grandfather, Wallace, told me that for a short time, my parents were truly happy. But their marriage had always been fragile. According to my grandfather, the cracks were already there, long before I was born. My father had a drinking problem. My mother, desperate to cope with the stress of his addiction, developed a gambling habit. They argued constantly, even while she was pregnant. One night, things went too far. My mother had discovered another one of my father's hidden bottles, tucked away beneath the sink. She was furious. She had begged him to stop drinking for the sake of their child, but he refused. When she confronted him, he became enraged. In his anger, he grabbed a pair of scissors from the counter and threw them across the room. She turned away just in time, but the blade clipped her eye, leaving her with a partial corneal laceration. She was rushed to the hospital. Bernard was terrified. He begged her not to press charges, promised he would change. My mother, despite everything, chose to believe him. She came home. And nothing changed. When I was born, my parents tried to do better. But it didn't last. One day, my mother came home from work and heard me screaming from my crib. She found my father passed out on the couch, an empty bottle beside him. She was furious, but Bernard waved her off, telling her, it was just one drink. It wasn't just one drink. It was every day. After that, my father began hiding his drinking. He would wait until my mother left for work before taking his first sip. Some days, he would forget to feed me. Other days, he was too intoxicated to even notice when I needed a diaper change. By the time I was 3, my grandfather Wallace started checking in on us frequently. He would find the house in complete disarray, dirty dishes stacked in the sink, unwashed clothes tossed over furniture, and trash piling up. And me? I was always filthy, hungry, and crying. Wallace tried to reason with my father, but Bernard refused to listen. He told my grandfather to mind his own business. Then, one day, my grandfather arrived and found my father stumbling around the house, laughing uncontrollably. I was on the floor, my clothes soaked, crying. That was the final straw. When my mother got home that evening, my grandfather said, "Thane is coming to live with me until Bernard gets himself together." My father protested, but my mother didn't argue. She knew it was the right choice. Moving in with my grandfather changed everything. For the first time in my life, I felt safe. Wallace made sure I had warm meals every day. He bathed me, tucked me into bed, and read me stories at night. I didn't realize that this was how parents were supposed to act. Because I had never experienced it before. I thrived under my grandfather's care. I was no longer a forgotten child in a house filled with empty bottles and arguments. But all good things must come to an end. After 6 months, my father completed rehab and received a sobriety token. He came to my grandfather's house, looking like a changed man. "I'm ready to be a father again," he told me. But I didn't want to go back. I cried and begged my grandfather to let me stay. But Bernard said I had no choice. I was going home. Returning to my parents' house was a nightmare. The walls carried memories of my father's drunken rage, my mother's silent suffering, and my own loneliness. At just 5 years old, I developed an eating disorder. The stress made me anxious around food. I would hoard snacks in my room because I was scared that one day, I might be hungry again and no one would feed me. My parents tried. They put me in therapy, attempted to build trust with me, and, at least for a little while, things seemed to improve. For the first time in their marriage, my parents weren't fighting. My father tried to be more involved in my life. My mother cut back on work to spend more time with me. I was beginning to trust them again. Then one afternoon, my mother and I walked through the front door. And found my father with another woman. I was too young to fully understand, but I knew that what I had seen was wrong. My mother? She just stood there. Frozen. Bernard and the woman scrambled to cover themselves. "Go upstairs, Thane," my mother whispered. The moment I reached my room, the screaming began. I curled up on my bed, clutching my pillow, trying to block out the shouting, the accusations, the blame. And then I heard something I would never forget. "It's your fault, Francine," my father yelled. "You're always disappointed in me. She makes me feel like I'm worth something." I shut my eyes and wished I was anywhere else. That night, my grandfather picked me up. He barely spoke a word to my father. For the next 2 weeks, I stayed with Wallace while my parents worked things out. My father called me every day, pretending to be worried about me. But by then, I knew the truth. He didn't care about me. He only cared about himself. I was barely settling back into life with my parents when everything fell apart again. Despite the betrayal, my mother, Francine, made the decision to stay with my father, Bernard. I don't know if she still loved him or if she was simply too used to their dysfunctional relationship to walk away. But one thing was certain, I never saw my father the same way again. No matter how much therapy we attended or how many times he told me he was sorry, I could never shake the image of him standing in our home with another woman. The little bit of trust one had rebuilt with him was gone. And then, just 3 months later, my mother received devastating news. She had stomach cancer. It happened so fast. One afternoon, my mother collapsed at work, clutching her stomach in pain. When she was rushed to the hospital, doctors discovered that her condition was far worse than they had expected. She had been sick for a while but ignored the symptoms, believing they were nothing serious. By the time they found out, the cancer was already advanced. She needed treatment immediately. It was the beginning of long hospital visits, painful chemotherapy, and endless exhaustion. My mother was forced to take time off work to focus on her health. She had some savings, and my grandfather Wallace was willing to help financially. But Bernard? He was the least supportive person in the world. My father complained constantly about how difficult and expensive the treatments were. He refused to take my mother to appointments, leaving that responsibility to my grandfather. He didn't even try to comfort her. Instead, my mother became the one reassuring him. She promised him that once she recovered, she would go back to work and support him like she always had. But that wasn't good enough for him. Finally, my mother begged him to at least get a part-time job to help out. After much arguing, he reluctantly found work as a server at a local diner. His shifts were long, and he stayed out late almost every night. But I had my doubts. There was something about the way he avoided us that made me wonder, was he really working late? Or was he back to his old ways? With everything happening at home, I struggled to keep up with school. Our neighbor, Elias, had a son my age named Joel, and when his family learned about my situation, they offered to drive me to school every morning. That's how Joel and I became best friends. His parents had heard the stories, the loud arguments, the neglect, the way my father treated my mother. And so, they took me in. I started spending more and more time at their house. At first, I felt like an intruder. But the more I was there, the more I realized that Joel's parents weren't just being polite. They genuinely cared about me. When his father found out I loved blueberry pie, he made one every weekend just for me. His mother taught me how to play basketball, spending afternoons in their driveway practicing shots. They became a second family to me. And it wasn't a surprise to anyone when, years later, Joel and I started dating. My mother was getting weaker by the day. Despite all the treatments, her health continued to decline. And then one evening, the doctors told us the worst news of all. The chemotherapy was no longer working. There was nothing more they could do. They estimated that she had only a few months left. My mother spent those months at home, trying to make the most of the time she had with me. And then, one morning, I went to wake her up. But no matter how many times I called her name, she didn't move. I shook her shoulders. No response. I ran to my father, panicked. He called 911, but when the paramedics arrived, there was nothing they could do. She had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The pain I felt that day was indescribable. I couldn't let them take her body away until my father physically restrained me, holding me back as I cried and screamed. It wasn't until my grandfather arrived that I finally calmed down. I couldn't even imagine the pain he was feeling. The funeral was simple, but what happened afterward was the real shock. My mother's lawyer arrived to read her will. And that's when I learned something that changed everything. She had left everything to me. The house. The savings. All of it. Bernard's face went pale. He immediately demanded to see the paperwork. I watched as he flipped through the documents, his hands trembling with frustration. "This must be a mistake," he muttered. But it wasn't. My mother had changed her will long before she was sick. She had been of sound mind, meaning my father had no legal claim to the house. And that's when I realized, she had planned this. She had known, deep down, what kind of man my father was. And she had made sure that when she was gone, I would have a home of my own. Bernard refused to accept the truth. "What do you plan to do with the house?" he asked me. I told him the truth, I wanted to keep it. He tried to convince me to sell it and move somewhere else. But I refused. This house was the only thing I had left of my mother. I wasn't giving it up. Bernard sighed, looking defeated. "Fine," he muttered. And for a while, he let it go. But looking back, should have known better. Because he was never the type of man to accept defeat. Not when he thought he still had a chance to take back control. For the first time in my life, I owned something that was truly mine. The house my mother had fought to keep, the house she had made sure would be passed down to me, was legally mine alone. I thought that would mean stability, that I would finally have a place to call home without fear of losing it. I was wrong. Because my father, Bernard, had other plans. It didn't take long for my father to move on. Just 2 months after my mother's funeral, Bernard sat me down and said, "There's someone I want you to meet." I should have known better than to agree. I should have walked away. But I was curious. So when he took me to a small diner on the edge of town, I followed. And that's when I saw her. Sitting at the table, smiling as if nothing was wrong, was Marla. The same woman I had caught my father with years ago. I felt sick. I had so many questions, but the only words I managed to choke out were, "Is this the same woman?" My father looked at me, pretending to be surprised. "Come on, Thane, sit down," he said. "Let me explain." But I didn't need an explanation. I already knew. The way they exchanged glances, the way she placed her hand over his, the way she acted too familiar with him, it was clear. This wasn't a new relationship. This was unfinished business. I refused to acknowledge her. I barely spoke a word during the meal, ignoring every attempt she made to start a conversation. When we got home, my father was furious. "You're being rude," he snapped. "Marla is going to be a part of our lives now. You need to accept that." I told him I never would. A few months later, he married her. And just like that, she moved in. I had thought I would be safe in my own home. But the moment Marla stepped through the front door, she made it clear that this was her house now. One day, I came home to find all the photos of my mother and me missing from the living room. I ran to the basement. Sure enough, there they were, tossed carelessly into a box. When I confronted her, she smiled and said, "We need a fresh start. You can keep those in your bedroom." It wasn't her choice to make. But my father? He didn't care. At first, Marla focused all her energy on my father. She called him at work, checking in to make sure he wasn't staying out too late. She controlled how he spent money, who he spoke to, what he did on weekends. Then she turned her attention to me. She tried to control my schedule, demanding to know where I was going and when I'd be home. But I wasn't a little kid anymore. I shut her down quickly. "You are not my mother," I told her. "You don't get to tell me what to do." She didn't like that. So she found another way to get rid of me. The day I graduated high school, my father didn't even show up. I wasn't surprised. But it still hurt. Thankfully, my grandfather Wallace and Joel's parents were there, cheering for me as I walked across the stage. Later that evening, as I was getting ready to go to a small party with my friends, my father knocked on my bedroom door. "We need to talk," he said. I wasn't in the mood for another lecture about Marla. But then he said something that made me pause. "Now that you're an adult, you need to take on more responsibility. Confused, I asked what he meant. That's when he told me I needed to find a job and start paying rent. Marla had decided that I wasn't contributing enough. She believed that, as an adult, I should be helping with expenses. Never mind the fact that this house was already mine. Never mind the fact that she wasn't paying rent either. I was furious, but I kept my head down. I got a job at a small fast food restaurant, working late hours while applying to colleges. Eventually, I got into a local university. I wouldn't need to pay for student housing, but I needed a car to get to campus. So I asked my father for help. I didn't expect him to pay for everything. I just needed a little support. But instead of listening, Marla exploded. She accused me of being selfish, saying that they were already doing enough for me. My father? He didn't defend me. Just a few weeks later, I woke up to find construction workers in the kitchen. Marla had decided she wanted a new kitchen and bathroom. I asked my father how they could afford renovations but couldn't help me with a car. He got angry, saying I was being ungrateful. So I let it go. I kept my head down and stayed quiet. But Joel noticed how upset I was. He kept reminding me, "This is your house. Don't let them push you out." I wish I had listened to him sooner. Then, one day, I came home and saw my belongings packed in boxes. Confused, I called for my father. He and Marla came downstairs, smiling. They had an announcement. Marla was pregnant. And because she needed space for the baby, they had decided to turn my bedroom into a nursery. I needed to move out. I couldn't believe it. They were throwing me out of the house my mother had left me. My father suggested I stay with my grandfather until I could afford my own place. I didn't even argue. I packed my most important belongings, called a cab, and left. When I got to my grandfather's house, he was furious. "I'm going over there right now," he said. "They have no right to do this." But I stopped him. Instead, I told him, "I'm going to fix this the right way." Because my father and Marla had forgotten something. This house still legally belonged to me. And I was going to take it back. I sat in my grandfather Wallace's living room, staring at the floor, still trying to process what had just happened. I had been kicked out of my own home. The house my mother had left to me. The house my father and Marla had no legal claim to. And yet, they had treated me like a guest. Like an inconvenience. But they had forgotten something, this house still belonged to me. And I was about to remind them. The next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer. I had never needed legal advice before, but I wanted to make sure I did this the right way. After reviewing my mother's will and the property documents, the lawyer told me something that made me feel a glimmer of hope. Your father and Marla have no legal claim to the house. If they refuse to leave, you have every right to evict them. He advised me to issue a formal eviction notice. If they refused to comply, I could take them to court. And so, with my grandfather by my side, I went back to the house. With my own keys. I didn't bother knocking. I didn't need to. I unlocked the door and walked inside. The house was empty. Perfect. Without hesitation, I called Joel's parents, who owned a locksmith business, and asked if they could help me change all the locks. By the time Bernard and Marla returned home that evening, the locks were different, and I was standing on the front porch. I refused to let them in. Marla's smile faded the moment she saw me. She stepped forward, trying to open the door, but her keys no longer worked. "Thane, what is this?" my father demanded, his voice tense. I handed him the eviction notice, signed by my lawyer. "You have 30 days to leave," I told them. "After that, if you're still here, I'll take you to court." Marla snatched the paper from my hands, her face red with fury. "This is unbelievable," she screeched. "I'm pregnant, Thane. You're really going to do this to us?" I didn't flinch. Because this wasn't my problem. Marla turned to my father, expecting him to say something. Expecting him to fight back. But Bernard just stood there. He knew I was right. For once in his life, he had nothing to say. So Marla did the talking for him. She begged. She cried. She tried to make me feel guilty. "This is cruel, Thane," she whispered. "How can you do this to your own family?" And that's when I lost it. "You are not my family," I snapped. "You made that very clear when you threw me out of my own home. For once, Marla was speechless. She tried one last trick. "If you make us leave," she said, tears forming in her eyes, "you'll be putting a pregnant woman on the streets." I stared at her for a long moment. Then I took a deep breath and said, "Not my problem." She looked like she wanted to scream. But there was nothing she could do. For the next few weeks, my grandfather and I stayed in the house while Marla and Bernard packed up their things. I refused to let them be alone in the house. I wasn't going to give them a chance to destroy anything out of spite. Every time Marla tried to argue, my grandfather simply looked at her and said, "You have 30 days. That was the end of it. On the last day of the eviction notice, I stood by the front door as they loaded their last bags into the car. Bernard looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped. Marla, on the other hand, looked furious. As she got into the passenger seat, she rolled down the window and said, "You're going to regret this." I didn't even respond. I just watched as my father started the car, pulled out of the driveway, and drove away. For the last time. Once they were gone, I took a deep breath. For the first time in years, the house felt peaceful. But I didn't want to stay. This place had too many painful memories. So I met with a real estate agent and put the house up for sale. At first, I considered reimbursing Marla for the money she spent on renovations. But after thinking about it, I changed my mind. She had remodeled the house without my permission. That was her own mistake. I owed her nothing. A few months later, I heard some news. Marla had given birth to my half-sibling. And soon after, she cheated on my father. Bernard was furious. He kicked her out, just like she had once kicked me out. Now, they're getting a divorce. I guess karma really does come full circle. As for me, I took the money from the house sale and rented a small apartment. Joel and I are still together, and I spend a lot of weekends at his parents' house. His dad still makes my favorite blueberry pie, and his mom still challenges me to basketball games. And Wallace? He visits often. We still watch old movies together, just like we used to. I finally feel like I have a real family. One that actually cares about me. Yes. Not long after his divorce, Bernard showed up at my door. He looked tired, like he had nowhere else to go. He asked if he could stay with me for a while. He even tried to play the "I'm your father" card. I just looked at him and said, "I don't have room for you." Then I shut the door. And that was the end of it. For years, my father and Marla treated me like nothing. They pushed me aside. They expected me to let them take everything from me. But I stood my ground. And in the end, I got everything back. Final thoughts. If you ever find yourself dealing with people like my father and Marla, don't let them win. Stand up for yourself. Protect what's yours. And remember, you are worth more than the people who try to break you. Thank you for watching the video. Like it if you watched the video to the end and don't forget to subscribe. Have a nice day.